Hello, and welcome to today's lesson where we are going to look at congruence shortcuts for triangles. So when we're looking at triangles, there's one way to prove congruence, and that is all angles are equal, all sides are equal. Okay, that's a lot of information. We're not always given that information. So what we want to do here is look at some shortcuts. What are some minimum requirements that we're given that can prove that two triangles are congruent? Okay, so now, when we look at this situation, if triangle cat and triangle dog are congruent, what does that tell us? Okay, it tells us that from those triangles, and I don't know if they're equal or not, so I'm going to make everything different here. But if we're looking at cat and dog, okay, we know that in looking at some of our previous lessons, okay, we need to make sure that they're orientated correctly to one another. And what we know is there's a 1 tick mark side on both, there's a 3 tick mark side on both, there's a 2. So DG, not DD, DG is congruent to CT, AT is congruent to OG, AC is congruent to OD. And then, we also have all of the matching angles in each triangle. So we know that all 3 angles match, all 3 side matches, and that tells us that they're congruent. Okay, so the converse would be if all of the angles and all of the sides match, then the triangles are congruent. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at how can we prove that triangles are congruent to one another. Okay, so now, our first conjecture that we have is the side-side-side congruence conjecture. If the 3 sides of one triangle are congruent to the 3 sides of the other triangle, then the triangles are congruent. Okay, and it makes sense because if we only have certain lengths, if this one's a 1 tick mark, this one's a 1 tick mark, if these are a 2 tick mark, these are a 2 tick mark, and this is a 3 tick mark, okay, if those lengths are the same, there's only one way we can put them together to make a triangle. Now, the triangle could be flipped around a little bit, but we can always change the orientation of the triangle. So if we know that the 3 sides of each of the triangles match up lengthwise, then we know that the triangles are congruent. And that's one thing we're always looking for. Put the tick marks in. Okay, make sure you have any information that you know. Make sure that you put the tick marks in because we're going to use those tick marks to help us come up with the type of congruence when we're looking at some of these later problems. Okay, now our next one, side angle side congruence conjecture. If 2 sides and the included angle of one triangle are congruent to 2 sides and the included angle of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. Okay, so if we're working off of these, just 2 sample triangles, what we're talking about here is we know this angle and this angle are congruent. Okay, they have the exact same measure. Now, the 2 sides have to be the 2 sides that make up this triangle. So I need tick marks here and tick marks here. Now, what happens is, some of you might be looking at this and saying, well, what about the 3rd side? And here's the important part of side angle side congruence. If we know the lengths are locked in, we know that these pieces have to stop at these dots. The angle is locked in. So since the angle is locked in, it can't be bigger, it can't be smaller. There is only one possible way to connect these two. And when we're looking at our congruent statements, and I'm going to back up and look at the first one here in just a second and show this as well. When we're naming our congruent statements, I have a side and side that are congruent. I have an angle and an angle that are congruent. And I have a side and a side that are congruent. Notice how the naming has to happen, and we can go in either direction. We can go clockwise, we can go counterclockwise, but what we're doing is we're finding those pairs that we know about, and then we're working our way around the triangle, and that gives us the naming of the type of congruence. So if I go back and look at this one here, side, side, side congruence. Okay, notice that I've got a side and side that are congruent, a side and side that are congruent, and a side that are congruent. So if I go clockwise, you can see that it's SSS that I get to. If I go counterclockwise, it's SSS. Okay, so you really want to think about and name those values, because then it really locks in the answer for you as you're working through. Okay, so now, what's one of the congruence ideas if we're picking three pieces in order that doesn't work? And the one that we have here is the side-side angle. Okay, it's also, and what we say with this one is you never want to say a bad word when you're doing a congruent statement. Okay, so it's also known as the ASS congruent statement, because if you notice here, we've got an angle, we've got a side, and then I want to make sure that that's a different length, and then we've got another side. Okay, so if we were to name this, we had an angle, we had a side, we had a side. Now, the problem with this, since the included angle is not locked in, we have two possibilities where this second side can be. Okay, this second side is not fixed, so it can actually swing back and forth between these two possible landing points. So we don't know if we have a small acute angle, a bigger acute angle, is it an obtuse angle? So this angle can slide. It's not fixed in a spot. So that's the reason why the SSA or the ASS congruence idea does not work. Because if we look at these two pictures, these are two triangles that are both built with an angle and then two sides that are not included with that angle. One of the sides is, but the other one isn't. And that's why the ASS or the SSA congruence idea does not work like the other two to give us perfect matching triangles. Okay, so now let's work through a few examples here so you can get to see how this process works. So when we're looking at this situation, what we have is, we can see based on tick marks, we have a side and a side. Okay, up at the top, we've got an angle and an angle. Okay, and now, and this is one thing you're always going to want to look for in any of these pairs, is you want to look for a shared side or a shared angle. So if you notice, BD is the same side length for both triangles because it's the same thing. It's BD. Okay, so I put a 2 tick mark there, and then I can label that with an S. Okay, so I have, in this situation, AB is congruent to BC. Okay, so I'm looking for my pieces. And I guess I should, if I want to call it correctly, I would call it CB. Okay, I know that angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD. And then the funny one, okay, and this is, so here's my side, here's my angle, and then the next piece I have is BD is congruent to itself, not BB. Sorry, sometimes doing these at 6 o'clock in the morning make a couple mistakes. Okay, is another side. So if you can see, as we work around the triangle in either direction, we're not skipping over any multiple pieces, but we've got an SAS, so it's side angle, side congruence for this pair. And one thing you can do is really start listing the things that are congruent. This is something you're going to need later on in this unit. We don't need it right now, but it's a good thing to start working with. Okay, so now the one piece that we're looking for, and this is called the reflexive property. The reflexive property is when you have a side length that is shared between two triangles, or you have an angle that is shared between this triangle and this triangle. Okay, so when you have a shared side or a shared angle, we know automatically that it's congruent. Okay, and we'll talk about this later as well. This is called the reflexive property. Okay, so now, when we're looking at these situations, we have to go back and think about, what are some of our parallel line conjectures? What are some of our angle conjectures? Because when I look at this right now, I'm like, do I have enough? I know that BC is congruent to DC. Okay, that's a side. Okay, so I can put a side and a side in each of those. I know that AC is congruent to EC. That's another side. Okay, so I've got a side here, a side here. Okay, but I only have two pieces. How can I get something else? Okay, if we think back to our earlier work with angles, we also know that this angle and this angle are congruent. Okay, why are they congruent? We want to think about our names. We would call this a vertical pair. Okay, it's a vertical pair, or what I call sometimes an X angle. Okay, so we've got that X angle, and this one actually fits in between. It's the included angle. Okay, so I can put my A here and my A here. Okay, but we know that BCA is congruent to DCE. Okay, and that's the angle, and that would go in between the two because it's in between the two in the picture. Because notice, if we had it actually in this order as we work our way around the triangle, this wouldn't be a true congruent statement. But since the angle is in between the two sides, they are side, angle, side congruent. And remember, we're always looking for naming them as we go clockwise or counterclockwise around the triangle. Okay, we can't skip over any more than one part, and the parts are the sides and the angles. So if we notice here, we are going side to an angle to a side. Okay, so that's how we can name our triangle congruence, side, angle, side. Okay, a couple more examples here. If you feel like you're getting the gist of this, you can jump into the homework because all we're going to do is just look at some additional pieces. Okay, so now we've got a couple things here. Okay, we're looking at what we're given and seeing, can we prove if they are congruent? Okay, now the hard part here is how the information is given to us in this diagram. We're told that PO and SO are congruent. Okay, so those are some tick mark angles there. And in that situation, we can't tick mark the whole side because there's this shared piece right here and right here that has the one tick mark. Okay, so we know as we work our way around, okay, we've got PO is congruent to SO. Okay, that's given to us. Those are tick marked pieces. Okay, and then as we work our way around each of these triangles, then we get to the one tick mark pieces where we have RO is congruent to MO. Okay, so we have the side and side. Now what we have to see is the angle in between those sides included? Okay, so now this is where I'm going to really want to try to color code these pieces. Okay, I know that this one is congruent to its pair. I know that this side is congruent to its pair. And then the last thing that we have to prove here, why is that angle a congruent angle? Because it's the same angle in both triangles. Okay, so this is where we would put this angle in the middle, because it's in the middle of the two sides in the diagram. So angle POS is congruent to angle SOP. And now I have side angle side congruence. Okay, it's really important to diagram these, put the letters in, making sure that you're getting them in the correct order. Okay, now, last one we have here, okay, looking at our last example. Are these triangles congruent? Okay, we're off to a good start. Okay, we've got BC is congruent to DC. Okay, that's given, that's a tick mark, and that's a side. We know that AB is congruent to ED. Okay, that's a tick mark piece, that's a side. Notice I left a gap here in the middle, because what I have to see is I have to see if my given angle that I know is congruent is in between the two. And if it's not in between the two, okay, here's the one pair that I know is congruent. Here's the other part that I know that is congruent. And here's the problem with this diagram. Here are the angles that I know that are congruent. They are a vertical pair. And those angles are not in between the two sides. It's touching one of the sides, but it's not touching the other. So that angle pair would have to go on the outside. So we've got BCA is congruent to DCE. Okay, we know that that's true, but notice the angle is not inside, so these are not congruent triangles. because we can't use the ASS or the SSA congruent statement for those problems. Okay, thank you, and that is the end of our lesson. First two congruent statement types, side, 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 and side, angle, side. Thank you, and have a good day.